Imagine a Predator drone, a $20 million marvel of engineering, hovering at 25,000 feet, armed with laser-guided Hellfire missiles that can hit a coin from miles away. Now, look down. Below that drone is a man in leather sandals, carrying a rusted AK-47 from the 1980s and a flip phone taped to a battery. On paper, this isn't a fight. It's an execution. You have NATO, an alliance representing 50% of the world's entire GDP, wielding the most terrifying array of night vision, satellite intelligence, and armored might ever assembled, facing off against a group of insurgents who don't even have a formal uniform. The math says NATO wins in a weekend. But as history now shows, the math was dead wrong. For 20 years, the world's most advanced military machine was systematically dismantled, not by superior firepower, but by a strategy that turned NATO's greatest strengths into its biggest liabilities. How do you beat a superpower when you can't even see it? To understand how the unwinnable was won, we have to look past the bullets. We have to look at the invisible factors that no computer model could account for. Was it the jagged, unforgiving ridges of the Hindu Kush? Or was it a psychological game so deep that it turned NATO's own democratic values against them? Over the next 20 minutes, we're breaking down the 5 specific tactical pillars that allowed a low-tech insurgency to outmaneuver the greatest military alliance in human history. We're going to see how the invisible enemy stayed hidden in plain sight, how time itself was weaponized, and the shocking reason why NATO's billion-dollar tech actually made them easier to target. But first, you need to understand the sheer scale of the mismatch. When NATO moved into Afghanistan, they didn't just bring soldiers, they brought a civilization. We're talking about massive forward operating bases, FOBs, that looked like small cities equipped with high-speed internet, Burger Kings, and air-conditioned barracks. They had the eye in the sky, total battlefield awareness, and more funding in a single month than their opponents saw in a decade. On the other side, the Taliban had no air force, no tanks, no centralized logistics. They operated in decentralized cells, moving through the shadows, funded by local taxes and black markets. To NATO, war was a science, a series of targets to be deleted. To the Taliban, war was an environment, a state of being. NATO was playing a high-speed game of chess. The Taliban was playing a game of Go, where the board was on fire. The collision of these two worlds created a friction that changed warfare forever. And it all started with the ground beneath their feet. NATO forces are built for the plains of Europe. They want flat ground, clear lines of sight, and heavy vehicle mobility. Afghanistan offered none of that. Imagine a U.S. platoon, laden with 80 pounds of high-tech gear, oxygen deprived at 10,000 feet, trying to secure a valley. To them, the mountains were an obstacle. To the Taliban, the mountains were a fortress with infinite exits. The insurgents used the reverse slope tactic, positioning themselves just over the crest of a ridge. When NATO planes flew over, they saw nothing. The moment the planes left, the insurgents popped up, fired, and vanished into caves that had been mapped out for centuries. Scenario: a NATO convoy is snaking through a narrow mountain pass. Suddenly, the lead vehicle hits an IED. The road is blocked. Fire rains down from 3 different directions. High ground NATO can't reach with their heavy armor. By the time the call for air support is processed, the mountain is empty. The Taliban didn't fight the terrain. They became part of it. This forced NATO out of their armored bubbles and into the green zones, where the technology started to fail. How do you target an enemy that doesn't wear a uniform? This was NATO's nightmare. The Taliban mastered the art of the farmer by day, fighter by night. In a digital age where facial recognition should have made anonymity impossible, the insurgents utilized the human shield not as a physical barrier, but as a tactical one. They lived, ate, and slept among the population. This created a detection dilemma. If NATO fired on a suspected insurgent and hit a civilian, they created 10 new recruits for the Taliban. If they didn't fire, the insurgent lived to plant another IED. It was a lose-lose scenario. Every NATO victory in the field was a potential strategic defeat in the hearts and minds of the locals. But if they couldn't be seen, how did they actually strike back? The Taliban never tried to hold territory against a NATO push. They practiced what Mao Zedong called the Flea strategy. The flea bites, the giant hits himself trying to swat it, and the flea is already gone. They used shoot-and-scoot tactics. They would engage a NATO patrol for exactly 3 minutes, just long enough to cause chaos, but not long enough for NATO to coordinate a devastating counterstrike. Their primary weapon wasn't the rifle. It was the IED, improvised explosive device. The IED is the ultimate asymmetric equalizer. It's cheap, it's terrifying, and it requires zero bravery to deploy. It forced NATO's billion-dollar mine-resistant vehicles to crawl at 5 miles per hour, making them sitting ducks. Scenario: a squad is patrolling a village. A cell phone rings. A hidden jug of fertilizer explodes. No enemy is in sight. The squad is now pinned down, tending to casualties, while the triggerman is already 2 villages away, drinking tea. Modern militaries rely on morale and public support. The Taliban knew this. They didn't need to kill every NATO soldier. They just needed to make every soldier afraid and every Western voter bored. They used night letters, threats delivered to the doorsteps of anyone cooperating with NATO. They created an atmosphere of omnipresence. "You have the watches," they famously told captured soldiers, "but we have the time." They used social media and propaganda to highlight NATO's mistakes, amplifying every accidental civilian casualty to a global audience. They turned the transparency of Western democracy into a weapon. While NATO had to answer to parliaments and the 24-hour news cycle, the Taliban only had to answer to their own resolve. They weren't just fighting for the valley. They were fighting for the will to fight. This is the most critical pillar. NATO operates on 4-year election cycles. Generals want results in 6 months. The Taliban operates on generations. To the Taliban, a 20-year war is just the opening chapter. They outlasted the British in the 19th century and the Soviets in the 20th. They knew that eventually the Western taxpayer would ask, "Why are we still there?" They played the waiting game. Whenever NATO surged troops, the Taliban simply melted away into Pakistan or into the mountains, waiting for the surge to end. They didn't need to win a single major battle. They just needed to not lose until NATO decided to leave. It was a war of attrition where the exhaustion wasn't physical, it was political. NATO wasn't stupid. They adapted. They used special operations to hunt high-value targets. They deployed biometrics to track insurgents. They spent billions on counterinsurgency programs to win over villages. But here is the twist. Every time NATO adapted, the Taliban pivoted. When NATO secured the roads, the Taliban moved to the footpaths. When NATO used drones, the Taliban stopped using electronic communications. The more NATO professionalized the war, the more they alienated the local culture. The technology created a wall between the soldier and the citizen. A soldier in a $500,000 armored suit behind bulletproof glass cannot connect with a local villager. The very things that kept NATO's soldiers safe made them strangers in the land they were trying to save. The ultimate secret to why the Taliban outsmarted NATO isn't found in a weapons manual. It's found in the realization that you cannot destroy what isn't there. NATO was looking for a center of gravity, a capital to capture, a general to kill, a supply line to cut. But the Taliban didn't have a center. They were a ghost. They were a franchise. They were an idea rooted in the soil. This wasn't a war of strength versus strength. It was a war of strength versus fluidity. Like a hammer trying to smash water, the harder NATO struck, the more the water simply moved around the hammer. NATO spent trillions of dollars trying to build a clockwork state in a place that didn't want one, while the Taliban spent pennies to simply keep the clock from ticking. In the end, the most advanced military in history wasn't defeated by a better army. It was defeated by a better understanding of human patience. As the last C-17 lifted off from Kabul in 2021, a 20-year loop finally closed. We often think of outsmarting as being more clever or having better gadgets. But in the mountains of Afghanistan, outsmarting meant something different. It meant knowing your enemy's limits better than they knew their own. It meant realizing that a drone can see everything, but it understands nothing. The Taliban didn't win because they were stronger. They won because they were more permanent. It leaves us with one haunting question for the future of global conflict. In an age of AI, satellites, and infinite tech, is the most powerful weapon still just a person who is willing to wait forever? What if modern power isn't actually enough to win a modern war? If you found this breakdown of asymmetric warfare fascinating, you'll want to see our next video on why the indestructible tanks of the 21st century are suddenly becoming obsolete.